down, fell through the ground like Alice. Oh, what a sound. Oh, what a sound. Stress like Alice, like Alice, Alice.
Hi, everybody. Hello, and welcome to this episode of HCPL Writes, and the first in a series of events during Authorama and Authorama 365. My name is Casey Kogan. I am a library service specialist here at the Catherine Tyra branch of the Harris County Public Library. And today I'm going to be talking with acclaimed writing duo Alyc Helms and Marie Brennan, who together make up the pseudonym known as M.A. Carrick.
Hello. Hello.
So these are the writing duo that make up the author Alyc Carrick. They've written together the Rook and Rose series. The first book is called Mask of Mirrors, and we have plenty of copies here at the library if you wanted to check one out. All right. So since we just wrapped up Camp NaNoWriMo, I wanted to start off and talk a little bit about the writing process first. And so I just was going to ask you, did you participate in Camp Nano this year?
So I have actually never done NaNoWriMo in any particular form, though I am involved on the website For the Words that I know has a lot of sort of like interchange with NaNoWriMo stuff. Alyc and I joke that we did NaNoWriMo for 4 months straight when we wrote Mask of Mirrors, because that's like a 200,000 word book we wrote in 4 months. But that's not actually doing NaNoWriMo exactly. It was just we were on an extended roll for that.
And for me, I have attempted Nano a couple of times in the past, but I have never actually like completed. I'd never done the full 50,000. And I feel like that's a good example for, do what you can. And, anything that you do is a success. You don't have to get the 50,000, although it's great if you do, obviously. But yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any particular thoughts on the idea of like a writing season, or this like designated, writing month where you try and write as much as you can versus just like going out there and doing it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely used to have a writing season before I switched to writing full time, so now I'm kind of not allowed to just, kick off for the rest of the year. But when I was in college and graduate school, summer was really my writing season. Not that I didn't do anything during the year, especially like short stories and such, but every summer was, okay, now I'm going to go write my novel. Like that was my dedicated time. And I think there can be a lot of value in whatever form you're able to do it, whether it's like a seasonal yearly thing or like your weekends or your lunch break or whatever, of having some time that you can point to and say, this is when I do my writing, and that's what I'm focusing on in this time. Like I know that's the appeal for a lot of people with doing just like a creative writing class or an MFA program, is having kind of that official permission to say, okay, right here, I'm writing. There's nothing else I'm supposed to be doing with this time. Writing is my job for that stretch of time, whatever it may be.
Yeah. And I think also dovetailing off of that, or dovetailing into that, something, I'm a big fan of ritualizing your writing practice, and whether that's, you have like a particular time of day where that's your set apart writing time, or, you write on weekends, or you write on Tuesday nights, or you pick a month or a particular time where you're concentrating. I feel like setting that, kind of creating a ritual to set that aside as a special thing kind of helps you get into the mindset so that you're not doing the other things you might fill that time with that aren't writing. I think also, and especially for things like, NaNoWriMo and Novel in 90 and all these things, is very often that helps you find a community. And
Yeah.
I think that it's not often talked about enough, and it's often very hard to find communities around writing. And it's just so useful to have a community, to have people who kind of share that goal and share that interest, and also share the mindset of, I need to put time aside to do this. And it's, in choosing to do that as opposed to something else, and having people you can do that with, whether it's, doing write-ins with people, any of that kind of stuff, I think actually helps everybody who's involved in it stay on target. Yeah, stay focused.
Almost like
No, I think
holding each other accountable.
Yeah. No, the community part, I mean, whether it's like critique groups, or I've had things set up with just friends occasionally where we have like a weekly accountability check-in, and it's like, okay, time to tell everybody what you did this week, and you will feel ashamed if you say nothing. uh, I also want to give a thumbs up to the ritualized thing, because I realized at one point I'd basically rediscovered, I think it's called operant conditioning in psychology. I, quite by accident with my first novel, there was a song that I got really obsessed with around the time that I was working on it. So I listened to that song a bunch. And also I was working on that novel a bunch. And after a while, I realized when I heard that song, I thought of the novel. And I'm like, ring bell, I start salivating, looking for my food. Okay. Having those things, whether it's a time of year or just here's the thing that I do before I sit down to write, like I go make myself a cup of tea in this mug or something, that can be super helpful for getting over the activation energy of, okay, it's getting started that's often the hard part. So anything you do that gets you over that hump more easily.
Yeah.
All right. So now I want to ask about writing goals and that horrible thing that everyone is always aiming for, and that is the word count. It's like, what are your thoughts? Yes, no, we aim for word count, or we just letting it flow?
I mean, I think it depends on the writer. Like, some people, I am somebody who does go by word count. That my baseline when I'm working on a novel is I want to write about 1,000 words a day. And for the record, that's why I don't do NaNoWriMo, because the nano pace would be utterly destructive for me, and I have found that out the hard way. I can do it for short spurts. I can't do it for a whole month. And I like going the word count route because it lets me estimate pretty well, like, how many more days of work do I have? Like, if I think there's maybe about 30,000 words more left in the book and I write 1,000 words a day, okay, I've got about a month's worth of work left. But if you're in the approach where, like, say, going back to that idea of the lunch break, if your setup is my writing time is my lunch break, I've got half an hour, then it doesn't make sense for you to aim for a specific minimum goal, because what if it takes longer to get to that goal? It makes more sense for that kind of person to do it by time and say, okay, half hour button chair, whatever I get done in that half hour is good. The point is that I spend that half hour actually working, as opposed to, checking my phone and, looking at Twitter and then, well, I wrote 50 words.
Yeah. And I know for me, because I write by hand, I find it actually very difficult. And one of the challenges in our collaboration was me having to kind of transition to writing on my computer, the first draft of anything we were working on. So yeah, I usually write in journals by hand. And so it's really hard to kind of judge word count. Like, I vaguely know how many words are on a page, depending on the size of journal I happen to be using. And so I'll know that usually like 5 pages or so will transcribe to about 1,000 words. But for me, it's much more useful to have a set time. And because I'm on the journal, that's a set time that has me away from the computer, which is one of the reasons I do it.
Yeah.
And then my transcription pass is actually my first editing pass. And that's a place where I do a lot of like language refinement and making certain that not every paragraph is beginning with the same sentence structure and word, and all those kinds of little fiddly bits. And it's funny because I know that Marie and I in our co-writing, I know that I'm probably not as good at that in the first drafts that we do together on our co-writing, because I haven't had the journal and then the transcription portion for a lot of them. So yeah. But yeah, so I set myself time limits and sometimes page counts rather than a word count.
And I think we should say up front with all of these process related questions, like the overriding header on all of these comments is do what works for you. Like it's worth experimenting with different things and seeing how they turn out for you, but don't ever go, well, so-and-so says that you should do it this way, therefore I have to do it that way. Like, no, find the process that works for you. That might not be ours. That might not be anybody's. Like maybe you get up at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night to write, I was about to say in your blood on the floor. Don't do that. Probably that sounds
and also like let yourself iterate that process, because like sometimes your life will change, or just the way that you kind of interact with words, or even like from story to story it might change. What works better for one particular story, writing by hand, might be dictating in another story. I know a lot of people like write on a walk and they're dictating and then they transcribe, or they use computer.
How do you even
I don't know, but Corey does that, and I'm like
Yep.
I know for me, like my problem is like, oh, I need to look up the price of cloth in 18th century England, like right now. Like right now.
Literally a couple of hours ago, I slammed to a halt in what I was writing in looking up architectural terms for like the type of window I wanted to refer to. And I let myself do that because I'd already written a good chunk and I knew that soon I was going to need to start getting ready for this. So I was like, okay, we can grind to a halt on our architectural terminology here, but that is a pitfall to watch out for.
And then I look at the clock and I've spent 2 hours, and now for some reason I'm watching tsunamis on YouTube. I just don't know how I got here.
Oh God, yep. Yeah. I know how that goes.
And I will say I avoid that in the first draft journaling, but when I'm transcribing, I definitely fall into that hole. Yeah.
Or like, do you ever use like when you're writing, if you don't want to like stop and look anything up, like a filler word or like an X, and like you go back to that?
Brackets.
Square brackets are my friend.
Yeah. They're easily searchable. You don't use them for anything else. Also just like, they're like when I can't think of a word, because very often it'll be like, I know the word I want and it's just not there at that particular moment. And so, yeah, things like that.
Some people will use capital letters TK because that's a combination that basically doesn't show up in English words. So you can search for TK and find it, whatever's least disruptive to you, basically.
So you don't have to be afraid of the tsunamis. When you're in your YouTube rabbit hole. So what is your like research process like? I know we kind of brushed on that a little bit, but especially writing sort of fantasy, is there any research that goes into that? I mean,
yeah. Right, knee-jerk reaction, just boop.
Yeah, I mean, on some level, like my entire life has been research, because I'm just constantly like, reading nonfiction stuff, kind of trying to learn about different cultures or, different practices, or, even other hobbies that I've done, get incorporated. So there's that kind of like just constant, baseline picking stuff up that you might not need for that particular thing, but might come in useful later. And then there's like, targeted research where it's like, I need to know about economics in, Florence, medieval economics in Florence. I want to know more about that so that I can develop, my own economic system or something. Or, Marie did a lot of research on con artistry.
For the brain, let me tell you, like that's dangerous research to do.
Just like the FBI agent watching me. Like I swear I'm not doing anything bad.
Oh yeah, I've put in plenty of search queries that have probably got me into. Yeah, but I agree with what Alyc said, and this is one of the ways in which we're very similar. I've taken to calling myself an anthropological compost heap that stories just like sprout out of, and that is how I work. some of the people watching this may have heard some of the discussion that's been going around recently about the Clifton Strengths personality assessment that Becca Symes' Write Better Faster coaching uses. And I went ahead and did the Clifton Strengths test, and 3 of my top strengths were input, learner, and context, which are like 3 different angles on the, I just feed me, Seymour, feed me information, and I'm going to kind of interrelate it all, and then things happen from it. And what Alyc said about the difference between the like brain feeding versus the targeted research, I've come to realize sort of the hard way, that's a really important distinction for me. Because when I was writing the Onyx Court books, which are historical fantasies set in London, and they're basically secret histories in that I tried to keep the historical facts as close to reality as I could, but then slip my magic into the corners around them. And I've called that my home PhD in English history. I spent literally 4 years reading vast amounts about English history and related topics to that. And then the memoirs of Lady Trent, less so because they're not real history, but I was still reading like, okay, Isabella's going to go to like a Polynesian area, time for me to go read about Polynesia. And I reached a point at the end of that series where I realized I had lost what I had when I was in college and graduate school, which is just the random inputs, the things where it's like, I don't intend to write a thing about Mongolia, but I'm reading about Mongolia now. So cool. Like, let's put that in the brain. And so I've made a deliberate effort in the last few years to get back to that, to read the things, not because I have a story in mind and I need to research that story and I'm looking for these facts, but like I read a book on military intelligence in ancient Rome, and that night a short story fell out of my head that I had not planned at all. But reading about the loss of the legions in the Teutoburg Forest, I'm like, okay, we have a story now, cool. I don't generate those ideas unless I put things into my brain.
Yeah.
Which I think is a great segue into sort of the next thing I wanted to ask you. And there's this really famous quote, which is, to be a great writer, you have to be a great reader. And I wanted like your thoughts on that. Like, agree, disagree?
So this is one of the things that I mentioned that I was preparing my answer for as I was doing my makeup, because I realized I had a lot to kind of say or think about it, which is for me, that is true, but I actually don't agree. And the reason I don't is because I think like the idea of great writer or the idea of like talent is this kind of like tip of the iceberg veneer we put over a whole lot of like work and persistence and like preparation and kind of deep thought and all of the kind of stuff that goes into being a great writer. And I think that for the value of the work you put in, being widely read, like reading within your genre, reading outside of your genre, reading different kinds of not just fiction but nonfiction, like is one of the most valuable ways that you can kind of get to that point. But I don't necessarily think it's the only way, and I say that because I know there are a lot of people for whom that is not something that is easy or accessible for them. That's not the way that they kind of intake stories. And so as a reader, I think, yes, it is incredibly valuable, but I don't think it's necessarily the only way. I will say, however, that when you're writing books, and especially in like a genre, you're entering into a conversation that's been going on for a while. And just think about anytime you're having a conversation with a group of people that you've been talking for an hour, you've like covered a bunch of stuff, you're like really deep in the weeds, and somebody comes in and they're like blah about something that you talked about like 40 minutes ago, and you've kind of hashed that out.
Yeah.
And that's what it can be like if you're not like read in a genre. That can be how it ends up being. And so just being aware that if you're not widely read in a genre, you'll want to find out some other way to be aware of what the conversation is and has been, so that you might be writing something completely new and interesting because it hasn't been the conversation. Chances are it's probably been converted. It's probably been done.
Yeah.
So you want to know that. Yeah.
So you're telling me my idea about sparkling vampires may not be the new upcoming thing?
I mean, it's literally, you'll get somebody who's, comes in, they don't read or write any science fiction, but they come in with their story about time travel, and they've got this great idea about how, like, this person goes back in time and does a thing that means the conditions that cause them to go back in time wouldn't exist. And you're like, yeah, that's not new. Like your clever, awesome idea here, that has been done to death, resurrected, killed again.
And you can do an idea that's been done to death, resurrected, and killed again, because I love nothing better than a well-executed trope. I'm a folklorist. I like stories that are told and retold. But like, if you're just doing the same thing, like
Yeah,
if you're
is
not
well
putting a new spin on it, or if you're just not like nailing every bit of that trope in a way that people who are familiar with it can be like, oh my God, like that enemies to lovers was the best enemies to lovers I've ever consumed, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of my knee-jerk quibble with that quote is like, what defines a great reader? You know, we have not that we have a great handle on what makes a great writer either. There's different ways you could define that, but I think it's even muddier for a great reader. The thing that I would add to what Alyc said, and I agree with all of that, is the other thing that I will notice sometimes when I'm teaching writing is I'll look at somebody's fiction and think, you're writing the blockbuster movie that's running in your head. And it's somebody who's trying to write the way a movie would do things. And they don't seem to have the grip on how does prose fiction achieve these effects, because they're not the same. Like, the fundamental difference between fiction on the page and TV, movies, etc., is the two-channel thing, which I think Alyc is about to make that.
I was like, because we were talking about this a couple days ago or a week ago. Yeah.
Yeah, that, even right now, what you're watching right now, you hear what I'm saying, but you also see my body language. You have two channels, the visual and the audio, at the same time. Prose, you got one channel. It's the words on the page. And so the things that are done in movies, like the quick cuts between different scenes, those work better on the screen because of the way those channels can carry you from one thing to the next. Like, the soundtrack continues while the visuals change, which creates a feeling of continuity. I have literally read a book where it's like you are following, there's a character clinging to the outside of a truck, scene break, one paragraph scene inside the truck of somebody slamming on the brakes, scene break, back to the person on the outside of the truck. And I'm like, that is not prose fiction. So that's the main caveat that I would add to what Alyc said, is that if you're not reading fiction, you're not necessarily learning the techniques and how to make the fiction do the things you want. You're going to be writing it like the things you are consuming, which might be your video games or movies or something, and you won't play to the strengths of the medium.
Which screenwriting is also completely valid, you know what I mean? But that's something different.
But it's its own art form, right? Related, but not the same.
And so, when should someone be considered a writer? And is there a difference between a writer and an author?
So I realized I was grappling with a cousin of this question recently. I was talking to a friend about the fact that I've started writing poetry, which is weird. It's like my brain is speaking in tongues. I don't even know. And so we had a whole discussion about, at what point am I going to feel like I will call myself, notice I said I've started writing poetry, not I have become a poet. And I think the word poet, even more than the word author, has like this weird mystique around it that makes us weird. But I decided that for me, the answer was, at least in part, I will be a poet when I stop being faintly surprised that I've written a poem. Like, like, that happened. Then I don't think I'm a poet yet.
And I kind of have a similar experience in that about 2 years ago now, I decided I wanted to learn to draw. And I've had like somewhat difficulty like describing what it is I want to do, because it's like I'll usually call it like my arting, I'm learning to art or something like that. But there's like so much that goes into art, and I'm like, I just want to learn how to draw, like, comic level kind of figurative stuff. And so it's like I feel weird calling myself like an artist, because A, I'm still very much at the beginning of learning how to do that, and B, like there's just so much more. So I feel like the answer, as somebody who has absolutely no problem considering themselves a writer or an author, it doesn't really see a distinction between those two things, are if you're writing or thinking about writing or writing sporadically, or as long as you put some words on a page with intention, you're a writer, you're an author. But I also recognize that if you're not in a position of like Marie and I, and you're struggling with that, then you're probably thinking about yourself more more the way I'm thinking of myself as a, drawer, artist, and Marie is thinking about herself as a proto-poet.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I know that for me, and I want to emphasize this was kind of like my personal, where did I decide to draw the line? I do see a slight distinction between writer and author, because to me, author, for whatever reason, implies that the writing has been put in front of an audience in some fashion. If I'm only writing and I'm the only one reading it, I don't like that stage of my life. I don't feel like I was an author yet, but I was a writer. And I fundamentally, for writer, I sort of come down to a writer is one who writes. So there were stretches of my life, especially when I was younger, where I sure thought a lot about stories, but I didn't ever actually write them down. So maybe I wasn't really a writer then, because I thought about writing, but I didn't actually write. A writer is one who writes. So those were the distinctions for me. Was I actually writing the stories instead of just making them up and thinking about them for my own entertainment? And then when I put them in front of audiences, then it started being more of an authorial thing. But that was what I felt comfortable putting labels on myself for,
Yeah.
So speaking of audience, do you ever consider your reader or your audience as you're writing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Though not in the way that I think some people do. Like, we don't do the really targeted, especially, people who do indie publishing. There's a lot of market research and like, okay, what are the things that are hot right now? And so how can I work that into what I'm doing? That's not the kind of thing I do. But I think there has to be a subconscious thing of, is the reader going to find this word distracting? Is this clear enough? Have I put what I'm thinking on the page enough for the reader to pick it up? It's more in that sense rather than imagining like specific people.
And I think for me, and one of the better pieces of writing advice I ever got was from a friend of ours, Siobhan. Does she write under Von Carr now, or she's Siobhan Carter?
I think she's published under
now.
both Von Carr and Siobhan Carroll. Yeah.
Yeah, Siobhan Carroll. Yeah. So yeah, sorry, wanted to throw her out there for people who are interested. But I was working on something and I was trying to get from point A to point B, and I was interested in showing all, like, I thought I had to show all the bits in the between. And she said, like, and I was like, but it's all so boring. And she's like, well, if you're bored, your reader is going to be bored. So why do you need to show that at all? And I was like, oh, yeah, okay. And so I cut all that, and it was much, tighter and more interesting. And so very often when I'm thinking about the reader, like Marie said, it's what is going to be distracting, and also like, what's going to be interesting and interesting to them. And if I think it's necessary, but not interesting, how do I make it interesting? I will say also that with collaboration, very often the person I'm thinking about entertaining the most is Marie, because I'll write a thing and I'll be like, oh, she's going to love that line, or she's going to really like, yeah.
Yeah. I will add one thing that I actually got from Alyc, which Alyc, you probably weren't even thinking of here, but on the topic of specifically writing romance, not necessarily genre romance, but romantic relationships. Alyc has this great theory that there are basically three people involved in a fictional romance, or a minimum of three, I should say. There's, one character, second character, and the reader. And the writer's job is not just to get character A and character B to fall in love with each other, plus any others involved, but to get the reader to fall in love with their relationship. And so I think that's actually a useful tool for thinking about, how do you get the reader invested in this? What are the things you can lean on that are going to make them go, oh yes, I want more of that?
What is your ideal reader? What does your ideal reader look like?
Nerd.
Somebody who just like enthusiasm up the, like somebody who just really gets enthusiastic about things, like Squee. I like the Squee. Like, yeah.
I will admit, like, maybe not every writer loves this, but I shamelessly love the people who will not just go, oh my God, I love this book, but they'll start going into the detail about it. Because the thing is, when you're writing, you put in all these little things and you notice them because you're the one putting them into the story. And sometimes you sit there going, is anybody going to even notice that, like, there's a thing in The Mask of Mirrors where early on in the book, there is an ellipsis that is doing so much heavy lifting that you don't even notice. Like, the character just trails off on a sentence, and I'm like, and there is actually so much implied right there. Actually, there's more than one place I can think of where we've done that. And I'm like, nobody's ever going to notice. So those moments where somebody points at that tiny little detail and goes, I love this, you're like, yes, someone did notice. But we were also talking before we started about, not all books are for all people. And so there's an extent to which the ideal reader is the person who's going to love whatever game you're playing with that particular book. So for the Rook and Rose stuff, we very much took the approach to, number one, like really intricate, detailed world building, because that's our jam. So we want readers who like that kind of thing. And also the approach that we took to exposition was very much feeding it in through how the characters interact with their world rather than stopping and explaining, here's how this works. And so it's put in like tiny details here, there, and everywhere that as you read, you will build up what you need to know. And some readers love that. And we've gotten readers who are like, oh my God, the way you did that is beautiful. And there are other readers who really wish we would just stop and explain something for a moment. So, it's going to vary.
Yeah, and I usually describe it as our style is rather than like going to a strange city and going with the official tour, we're like, we hook you up with your college roommate's cousin's boyfriend, and they're taking you around to all the hot clubs and all the cool like restaurants and all the weird little places that you won't normally see. And you might not get like a great kind of overview of the city, but you're going to get a really rich embedded experience of what you need to know to have like a great time. Yeah.
Oh my, that was such great advice. I do want to move on. So to our next kind of part. And so we've written the book. We did the Nano. We did the 4-month writing sprint to the end.
And the hard part is just beginning. Sorry, people.
Now, like, what on earth do we do now? So as we come to like the close of Camp Nano, so for anybody who's like thinking about what they want to do next, I wanted to talk about traditional publishing first and sort of what that query process was like in getting your first agent and all that jazz.
So especially for me, like the way that I usually describe this when people ask me, I'm like, because I hate the authors who first published their like first novel in say 1978, and they are telling you how to get started in publishing. And I'm like, the world has changed, my friend. And I sold my first novel, I guess basically the offer came in 2004. And so like, it's not quite the Cretaceous in publishing, but like we only had just gotten anatomically modern Homo sapiens on the scene here. It was a while ago, people. So first of all, I will say anything that I think either of us, because Alyc, you sold your first book more recently, but it was still not that recently.
It was 2014, I think. So 2014, 2015 is when I got my so it's more recent, but it's still, things have changed since even then.
Changed, Twitter was not a thing when I was doing this, and so all of the like agent query pitching and stuff on Twitter with PitMat and things like that wasn't part of it. So the major thing that I will say, because this part hasn't changed, is that you need to have persistence. This is a long game you're playing. It's kind of horrifying in some ways to tell people, like they can get very discouraged when I say I wrote 6 novels before I sold one. On the other hand, I'll tell you there are some benefits, because I leveled up my writing game. And also it meant that, for example, when I sold my first novel and the publisher was like, awesome, we want a sequel. How long will it take you to write that? Number one, I knew I could write a sequel, or that I could write another book. Because if you sell your first novel and then somebody goes, great, do it again, you're like, and I knew roughly how long it would take me. I knew what my process looked like. So honestly, there was a lot less stress in many ways. And like agents, they often, an agent doesn't just want to sign you for one project. They're usually signing onto your career. And so when they say, this is cool, what else do you have? At least having other ideas, having other projects you've already written that, maybe could be polished up and sent out again, all of that is good. But yeah, it's a lot of beating your head against a wall until the wall says, fine, I give in, okay. And there are benefits to it, because like I said, leveling up my writing process, there is a certain amount of, the word gatekeeper, I think, has acquired an extremely negative connotation. But there is also something to be said for the people who are going, okay, you're not there yet. Like, come back when you've worked on it some more and you've gotten better. And that, like, view that as a challenge to do better, rather than just a discouragement of, oh, okay, well, you didn't want this, so I'm going to go somewhere else. Like, that can be incentive to work harder and level up more. So take that opportunity.
And I will also say, the flip side of that is if you're getting a lot of, rejections or, rewrites requests, or, I mean, if it's a rewrite request, that's amazing. That's good.
It is.
But yeah, if you're getting a lot of rejections, also realize that it's not necessarily you, because there are a lot of other factors from, we've just published 3 books like that. We just signed or published 3 books like this already, to there's just no room in our schedule, to there's a bunch of different reasons that a particular agent or editor might not be interested in the piece that you put before them. I know one of the things that even we got with The Mask of Mirrors, one of the kind of hesitations that we had from editors who were interested was the length, because it's really hard in the current publishing climate to publish longer books. And we don't even think it's particularly long compared to some, books, epic fantasy that are out there, but we still see, a lot of people it's a doorstopper, it's a chonker, and we're I mean, it's pretty standard for epic fantasy, but it's a different climate. It's in the Book Talk, Bookstagram, BookTube kind of environment. Shorter is and faster and clippier tends to be more popular.
And I think the shorter thing we'll probably come back to when we talk about indie publishing, because there are some factors there that I think are relevant. But yeah, so persistence, bear in mind that it's not necessarily you, but basically the way that I coped with rejection was I would kind of fall down and be sad for a little bit, and then I would get back up again with a feeling of, well, I'll show you then. And it's good to cultivate that.
Now, one thing I will say with the, especially looking for getting an agent, is there are so many great resources out there, and taking advantage, they're pretty easy to find and take advantage of, but things like Query Shark and the kind of various agenting databases that are out there. I'm trying to remember the acronym for the union, or the organization of organization.
Yeah, there's a professional
AAR. Yeah,
no, it's not the AARP, but I think AARP. Right. Association of Authors Representatives or something like that. Yeah.
And those are really good sites for also just knowing what's legit and what's kind of sketchy when you're looking for an agent, what might be expected and what isn't.
And even the ones who are legit, that there's nothing sketchy about it, especially if you've been querying agents for a while and somebody finally shows interest, it's still really important to have the conversation with the agent and make sure they feel like a good fit. Because I know there are plenty of, I've heard this from numerous authors of my acquaintance, that they finally got an agent and, hallelujah, there was somebody who was interested and they signed with that agent. And after a while, they realized this isn't the right person for me, because maybe they liked that one thing I did, but the rest of what I'm doing isn't really in their wheelhouse and they're not a good representative for it. So it can be the hardest thing in the world when you've been querying to have somebody offer representation and then you go, I don't think so. But it's better to do that than to be stuck with the wrong agent, seriously.
And I will say, coming from, I worked on the acquisition side for academic publishing, but I think it's true for agenting and publishing as well. Follow the damn instructions on the website. They might be slightly different, but if they want 5 pages in a synopsis and that's all they want, that's all you send them. Fill out the form correctly if they have a form. You will get so many brownie points just for being able to follow a damn direction. I have feelings about this, apparently very strong ones.
I'm very familiar with this problem. Even though I work in the library, we have signs all over the place.
Because the agent is deciding if they want to work with you. And one of the things that's going to be on their decision is, does this person, can they send me what I asked them for and nothing more?
Can they pay attention? Yeah.
So I wanted to sort of talk about, if you have a preference for a smaller imprint versus a larger one. So I know you're published by Orbit, and I just off my knowledge would assume that is a larger imprint, but is that the case?
Yes. Yeah. Orbit's one of the big fantasy publishers. Yeah.
So
and then I've also. Sorry.
You have a preference for a smaller imprint or a larger one?
So we've both got experience with smaller publishers. And I think in some ways, wow, it's really about to say it's not the size that matters. There is some relevance to that in that the larger publishers can have more clout in some ways that are useful to you and have more reach. But also you are going to be one fish among many in that particular pond. The thing that I would say is that with small presses, there's a bigger risk that you get one which has only been running for a short while. And so they don't necessarily have the track record of being able to remain stable. I've got a book called Driftwood that was published by Tachyon. I don't know how many decades Tachyon has been around, but they are an establishment in science fiction and fantasy. Tachyon knows their business. They are not going to just like flame out and crash 2 years from now. So that's a small press that it is really great to be published by them. When it's a small press that started up last year by somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience, yeah. So it's not the size so much as do they know what they're doing?
And I will say also, it depends on what sort of book that you've written, because there are risks that small presses and indie presses can take, and that people kind of expect from them. So when they're like looking for that kind of thing, that they know that they'll get that. If they want an Angry Robot book, they'll get a kind of book that Angry Robot publishes, and so you've got that kind of more niche vibe, and so that a book that might do well there would maybe not do well at one of the big presses like Orbit or Tor or something like that. And so kind of knowing how weird and iconoclastic your book is, an independent press or a small press might be better for you. Yeah.
And just to clarify for people who may not know, you mentioned Angry Robot, and that is a smaller publisher.
Yeah, Angry Robot is like a big small press, because it's fairly well known and well regarded, I think, in science fiction fantasy, and it's definitely published authors who have then gone on to do pretty big things. I think Chuck Wendick was a Angry Robot author. I know Wesley Chu was, a couple other people, Cameron Hurley.
Cameron Hurley, I was going to say, yeah.
Cameron Hurley, and me. And they're a UK publisher, but they have distribution in the US as well. And that's something else that you might or might not know, is that some publishers only publish in the UK or in the US, like in English. And so you might get books that will be coming out in the UK that won't come out in the US, or that come out in the US and won't come out in the UK, or you might get a publisher that publishes in both simultaneously.
Yeah. And looking past science fiction and fantasy, like there are regional publishers within the US. Like, if you're writing something that's really, a Southwestern kind of novel, then there might be Southwestern regional publishers who are really going to market to the people in that area.
Yeah.
Oh, and so I know, Marie, you said you had some sort of indie adjacent publishing experience. So I kind of wanted to introduce these writers who have just finished up Camp Nano to the sort of other side of the coin, and like the indie publishing route.
Yeah, so indie publishing, and to be clear, because sometimes there's confusion around this, it used to be that small presses were sometimes called indie publishers because they were independent, they weren't owned by big conglomerates. These days, indie publishing mostly means self-publishing, only that term had stigma, so now it's indie, right? So watch the wheel of terminology go. When we say indie publishing here, we're talking about the self-publishing kind of thing. My experience with that is very much in the shallow end of the pool, because I belong to an authors collaborative, like co-op, called Bookview Cafe, which consists of authors with a history in traditional publishing for the most part. I think all of our members, there might be one or two exceptions. And we basically give each other the labor for self-publishing our books. So somebody else copy edits my work, somebody else in the co-op does my cover art, does my ebook formatting, and so on. If you're doing this not as part of a group like Bookview Cafe, then you are your own publisher. That means you've got to arrange for all of the things you've got to get. You've either have to learn to format yourself or hire someone to do it. You either have to learn to do your own cover art or hire someone to do it. I recommend hiring someone unless you're really good at design. One of the easiest ways to make your book look horrible is to have a cheap, badly done cover on it. And the part of it, and this is why I'm really sort of in the shallow end of the indie publishing, is that if you really want to like succeed in that, in a lot of cases, it requires certain kinds of hustle that I don't have in me. Like the thought of having to do all of the promotional marketing work that a lot of the indie authors do, where like you're organizing ads for your books in different places and setting up like, a freebie giveaway here, and you're doing all these things to kind of funnel people into your newsletter, and you're price pulsing, and you're repackaging it with new covers. And I'm exhausted just saying that. And we mentioned before the thing about the length of books. This is driven especially by, I won't get too far into the guts of this, but the way Amazon, specifically Amazon, has set things up, it rewards frequent publication. It rewards the people who can write fast. And when I say write fast, I mean, if NaNoWriMo seems like fast writing to you, it goes so much higher than that. People who write 5,000, 10,000 words a day. And so it also rewards shorter books. Because if you have your series where you're putting out one like 40 to 50,000 word book every 2 months or something like that, then that is what Amazon systems in particular reward. So you kind of got to be going all the time at what to me is a breakneck speed, and to many people is a breakneck speed. Now, that's not to say that you can't do indie publishing at a slower pace and without all of this stuff. But if you're kind of aiming for, you hear these stories of that person is earning 6 figures a year. Like, yeah. What's the work they're putting into doing that? Because you don't have a publisher taking care of that for you. That is all you and the people you are paying your own money for. So take that into account.
And Alice, did you have any sort of experience, interactions with the indie publishing world?
Not directly. I have acted as an editor for some of my friends who have, but that's about all. And I it's daunting. Just even watching all the work that they've had to put into it is, as Marie said, it's exhausting just thinking about it. But I also know that for some people, being able to have insight into all of that and have that kind of control is what is important and valuable to them. And I am glad that the stigma is hopefully starting to go away, because I think that there's some, I was talking about small presses and how you can really do some interesting iconoclastic and niche stuff, and I think that that's also true of there's indie published stuff that a publisher would not take the risk on. Not
take the risk on or not understand, because I was thinking about this when we were talking about traditional publishing. I spoke in defense of the ways that gatekeepers can be kind of a good thing, because there is a certain amount of like quality control that goes on there. I know that's like not a phrase people like to hear, but there is also a side that's very real, which is that you get publishers who are going, well, this is too queer, or like, oh, well, this is really, really, Chinese American. We don't believe we have a large enough audience for that, in ways that can be very bad. And that's especially true with sometimes the bigger publishers, because they've got sort of bigger financial gambles going on. And so just as with the small presses, it might be better to go with a publisher that really gets the thing that you are doing. Then with indie publishing, you've got the freedom to take those things that the bigger publishers aren't really willing to touch for sometimes very bad reasons. Like sometimes it's not like that it is you personally, but sometimes it is the thing that they're looking at your perfectly good, well done story, and they don't know what to do with it because they don't have sort of the flexibility of mind around it. So that's the other side to what we were saying earlier, that you get people who seek out indie publishing because they know that or their experience at least is that the publishers aren't interested in what they're doing. And so indie publishing is a way for them to still find their audience. And that's great. Oh, hello, Thrace.
We have a friend.
Yay!
Guest
Oh, guest appearance. I was hoping this would happen.
Thrace is one of the stars of our Discord. We have a channel called the Daily Thrace for cat pictures.
Just gonna get his tail.
His head showed up for a bit.
So how has your publishing experience differed as a duo? Because you're each authors in your own right, in your own perspective works, but you also wrote a book together. So was that experience any different?
I mean, the baseline of it is the same. You still go through all the same steps that you normally would. You do run into things like, okay, copy edits. Both Alyc and I want to go through the copy edited manuscript because we're enough of control freaks that we can't just say, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. But they don't give you extra time. you still get the same amount of time for both of you to do it, and you can't work simultaneously. So welcome to having half the time. um, there were some discussions around, were we going to do a joint pen name as opposed to having it go out as by Marie Brennan and Alyc Helms. And, there are marketing considerations that go into that. We did a joint name for a number of reasons, one of which was that we were a debut author, even though both of us have published before. So you get some marketing, bump from that. And it helps clearly brand the stuff as well.
Yeah. And I think for us, like, some of the things that we weren't really sure on when we first went in, and obviously learned along the way, were just how the agenting thing works. And for us, it ended up being, we each have separate agents at separate agencies, and they ended up kind of splitting the work and dividing it according to who had the better resources or contacts in a particular area, which I think has worked out really well, because, it means we've got basically two agents working on the thing.
For other people, it might be you get like a separate agent for your joint work who just represents your collaborative stuff. Like, there's different ways to handle it, but those are logistical questions that come in.
Yeah. And so to wrap up sort of this portion before we move on to the book and Rose is, I wanted to sort of know what literary success looks like to you.
I mean, I'm able to write full time, and that's pretty good success. But there is the thing, like, this is very real, that there's like a whole list of achievements to unlock. And as soon as you unlock one, you're looking at the next one going, okay, so like I've gotten award nominations for things like the World Fantasy or the Hugo, but I haven't won it yet. And also, I haven't gotten a nomination in short fiction yet. Could I get that? Like, there's always something else for you to aim for.
Yeah, and I think that's, there's an element of, you can drive yourself kind of mad, trying to hit all of those, because it's like, you look at the award nominations and wins, and you're like, oh, that would be great, but maybe you're not writing the kind of thing, that is nominated for or wins awards. You could be like, it'd be really nice to be, a self-supporting author, so you don't have to have your day job and everything like that. But again, and maybe that's not something you necessarily have control over. And so I got really good advice from instructor, one of my Clarion West instructors, that was, find the thing that is a goal that you kind of have and have control over, and kind of make that. And I know for me, and I know this is true for many people, it's having the sort of impact and meaningfulness for readers that my favorite authors have had for me. Like, I have my favorite authors who have, like, I'm gonna get all choked up, who have like really positively impacted my life, in some cases like saved my life when I was going through dark times. And the idea that I could do that for someone else, or something that I write could do that for somebody else, that's success. Being able to make a living out of it would be nice, but that's like the
I've had that as well. There was a period of several years where I was sort of following in Mary Robinette Kowal's footsteps of saying that in the month of February, people could write letters, like actual physical put it in the mail letters, to Lady Trent, and I would write back with I've got like a dip pen, and I would write in my best cursive and like seal it with sealing wax and the whole bit and send it back to them. And some of the stories I got from people for whom, Isabella's life circumstances and journey were like relevant to what they had gone through and their own struggles and so on. I got one person who wrote and basically said, I am writing this letter on behalf of my newborn daughter, and when she's old enough, I'm going to read the reply to her. And I was like, pardon me, give me a moment. Those are the moments that, as much as it's really easy for us to focus on the external markers of success with like, how much money have you made? Has somebody made a movie of your stuff? I wouldn't mind a movie. That would be great. Or TV show. These would be excellent. Especially because, money comes with those, and money's nice. But fundamentally, the thing that gets me the most are those moments where you realize that, you've changed somebody's life. And the funny part is, it's not even always like the deep and meaningful stuff you've written. It could be something really frivolous, and somebody was like, I was having a really hard time, and then I read this story of yours, and it made me laugh when I needed that. And like, even the silly toss-away things can be important to somebody in ways you'll never know.
Yeah.
That was so great. But now we
Hope
move
they
on.
won't cry.
Which
Like,
also
there's
means
2%.
if you have an experience where a writer did that for you, tell them, because it will matter
Yes.
to them.
So now I want to bring up one of my favorite books. We have The Mask of Mirrors, which we have plenty of copies of here in the Harris County Public Library System. But I was wondering if we have anybody watching who is looking for sort of writing advice, if you guys could give like a little summary about your series, because I do know the third one is coming out next year.
Yes. I don't know if Alyc has the.
You make me do this. You always make me do this.
Yes, I always make you do this. You should know by now. I usually will pitch it by just quoting The Princess Bride at people and saying, fencing, fighting, torture, revenge, giants, monsters, chases, escapes, true love, miracles. Though in fairness, I will say the tone, like, there are some parts of The Princess Bride that show up there. There's more than a little bit of, the man in black in the Rook and such. But it's... the complex world building, politics, intricacies, as we've got a con artist main character who's trying to infiltrate the nobility and doing like a tightrope act where she could end up in a great deal of trouble if she's caught. And, running into a hooded vigilante who hates the nobility, and so that's a bit of a problem for her. Got some like Zorro, Scarlet Pimpernel in there around the Rook.
Yes, for
and
sure.
a morally gray crime lord with a peacock spider companion who seems to be everybody's favorite spider.
Yes.
I will
make
say that
spider.
to anybody watching, Alcius is my favorite character. So keep your eyes peeled. And so I want to talk about a little bit about Ren. So Ren is the main character. And so one of the most interesting things about her is, so as you mentioned before, she is a con artist. And so she's wearing all of these many masks and she's taking on all of these different personas. And what struck me as I was reading was these personas have such a different flavor. Like when you're reading, you really can tell, like I can tell what like where she was in her mind space. And there's this one chapter where she gets disoriented and these sort of start to bleed together. And I thought it was so masterfully done. And so I wanted you guys to maybe like introduce Ren for our readers.
I think that one's on me because we have made no secret of the fact that this actually grew out of a role-playing game that Alyssa's running, and Ren might be my player character in that game. Different version of her. We basically had a number of characters, or I say a small set of characters, and the relationships between them and the way those had grown and changed that were really sort of tangential to the main plot of the game, and we were writing outside scenes about it, and then we realized we'd written like 50,000 words of outside scenes. But so that all grew out of the game. And I think one of the big tricks, this is sort of the like technique answer to Ren's personalities and identities feeling distinct, is that a lot of it is in the dialogue, that we used specific ways to mark, and if you listen to the audiobook, you hear this in the accents and such, that Renata speaks with a like received pronunciation British accent, Arenza speaks with a kind of Slavic accent, and there are things about how her sentences are constructed that differ depending on which persona she's being in. And so ideally, if we do it right, like a single line of dialogue out of her mouth and you would know which character it is that's talking. Maybe not if it's super brief, but
and one of the really great things about Ren as a character, I think one of the reasons she's really useful from a technique standpoint is that, very often in fantasy, what you'll get the kind of, the newcomer, the ingenue, the person who doesn't know what's going on. And that can be, that can be a little old and tired because they're very kind of naive. And the great thing about Ren is that she is like very smart and savvy and does know what is going on. I'm just gonna have a hat now. But because she's playing somebody who's new to the city, she can pretend like she doesn't know what's going on. And you get this great tension and conflict between what she's saying to people and what the way she's analyzing situations in the background.
Yeah, and I was going to say, because she's manipulating people, we have the excuse to have her working through the math of what does she know and how can she use it, and so that gives us actually an opening for exposition that we wouldn't have if she was just, interacting with people honestly. She has a hard time with that.
So what was your favorite character to write?
I know what my favorite character to watch Alyc write is, and that's Arcady. There's this foul-mouthed street rat 12-year-old that every time, she doesn't show up that often, but Alyc basically writes everything that Arcady says, and I just love every piece of it.
I will say, yeah, that Arcady, and then also Tess, especially on scenes where it's like just kind of Tess doing her own thing. Tess is Ren's sister, and the seamstress who kind of like makes her con work from a sartorial standpoint. And Tess's scenes when it's just me writing, because usually we'll co-write, but sometimes for things like that, I'll go off and write my own. Those I do actually write in my journal ahead of time because her voice flows on the page like that, and then I'll transcribe it. And so I feel like that's another place where the voice comes really strongly through, because I'm able to do that. But she's just so much fun to write. Yeah.
While I have you on live television, can you give me any hints for the upcoming installment, Labyrinth's Heart?
I mean, I think we have posted on Twitter and on our Discord the photo of Thrace, the cat now behind Alyssa's head, coming and sitting on chapter 23 in the cards that we had on the floor while we were working on our plot. So clearly in chapter 23, a giant cat will crush Nadezhra. All of our characters get something at the end.
I will say, if book 2, my kind of internal tagline was "Give Vargo a bad day." I think book 3 is all the chickens come home to roost.
Oh, yeah. No. Okay.
Out of the end of a trilogy is that, like, you want to feel like the things that have been building up are finally, I mean, I'd say finally paying off. There should be payoffs prior to that, right? But you want to feel like it's all pulling together. And especially when you have characters like ours who have so many secrets they're keeping, so many lies they've told, so many things from their past that could come back to haunt them, just like all of that. Yeah, all the chickens come home to roost is probably a good tagline for it, though I don't think they'll put that one on the cover.
No.
I mean, so with our last couple minutes, I wanted to go through some of the questions that we've had, so to give people a chance to answer. But I'm going to go first because I'm the interviewer, so that's my right. So my question is, Marie, can I please use Anthropological Compost Heap as a band name?
Absolutely, but I want an acknowledgement on your first album.
Oh, absolutely. So we had Denise ask, how did you find or meet each other for co-writing?
So we have been friends for over 20 years now, because I think we met in 2000 at an archaeological dig.
Years.
Yeah, an archaeological dig in Ireland and Wales. We were both undergrad archaeology students.
30 minutes. The computer.
Sorry, as the library do their thing. Yeah, we were both archaeology undergrads, and field schools are a thing you just do. You go out in the summer and you work on digs. And that summer, honestly, was one of those kind of turning points for me in authors inspiring me, because I was a big reader and I thought about writing, but I hadn't really ever done much of it other than like scribbles and fanfic type stuff. And seeing Marie every night sit down in the Fines tent by the light of like a lantern with the winds of Wales and the rain coming down and like the smell of like dusty pottery, put down her 1,000 words a day, was the first time I'd actually ever seen somebody like appear who wanted to be a writer, doing the work necessary to become an author. And yeah, that was a huge turning point for me. And so, we've been friends for all this time and writing buddies, but it wasn't until 2016, I think, was when we started.
We had collaborated on an academic paper when we were both in graduate school, and I was nodding at the turning point thing because there are any number of things out of that field school that summer, most of them involving Alyc, that I would be like, yeah, that is sort of when that got started. And for the record, the book I was writing there was my first published novel, the second one that I finished, and that was originally called Doppelganger. It's now called Warrior. I like when you read that, parts of that were written in a pup tent in Wales. But yeah, we had collaborated on an academic paper at one point, but we didn't actually write fiction together until that stuff for the game, where we're like, okay, it would be fun to do a thing involving Ren and this NPC, basically the Rook. I should go ahead and just say that. And it was like a little caper thing that would be kind of more fun to, like, if you tried to play it with the dice, it might not go the way you wanted it to. So we said, well, let's just like writing it as a scene, and we opened up a Google Doc. And so literally the process that we use for writing the novels is like what we did for those game scenes, where we've got a Google Doc and we do it sort of like role playing, that each of us is controlling certain parts of it and contributing those parts. Though as time has gone along, we've crossed those boundaries more and more often. But yeah, so we knew each other for 15 years or something before we actually started writing any fiction together. And then we discovered it worked really well and we liked it.
Yes.
I'll take that down. Know someone for a decade at least.
Yeah, it's like, we've had people ask, like, how do you find a partner for collaboration? And it's a little bit like, I don't know, how do you find somebody to, marry? Just like many different ways. Some of them are serendipity. Some of them are shopping around a whole bunch. Like, it's a relationship of a specific kind. Oh, and I don't think we mentioned before, but if you look on our website, which is macarrick.com, under the extras section, we've got a link to our collaboration agreement that we signed ahead of time. We appear to have lost Casey's connection. I think we're still live though, so I'll keep talking.
We'll keep talking. The library is closed.
Yeah, there we go. That basically we signed an agreement before we started work in order to outline what did we expect out of this working relationship and to protect our friendship. So it includes things like, what are our expectations for how much work are we going to be doing on a weekly basis and so on, so that we would know, like, okay, rather than me going, I don't know, is there a problem? Should I say anything yet? Should I not say anything yet? We had it written out there of, if we drop below this line, we should have a conversation. Cool. So yeah, collaboration is a relationship and needs to be nurtured and protected and maintained like any other sort of relationship.
And I think because I have done collaborative writing with other people, and none of which has ever, I think, led to a published work, but I've had fun with it. And I think that that's the thing, is like, find somebody that you have fun writing with, and, figure out what your style of fun is going back and forth, and don't worry about publication and all of that stuff, like, because if you have fun with each other, then you'll figure out the rest. And it might be that that's not the goal of your collaboration, but yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hi. I was like, I should know how to make an exit. Thank you so much for your time. This has been such a great experience, and I'm so happy you were able to kick off Authorama with us. I'm really hoping that our writers and our readers are going to get a great experience out of this. So just thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
You're
so
welcome.
much for
Thank you for having
us.
us.
Say hi, Thrace.
Bye, Grace.
Oh, and so thanks everyone for stopping by, and thank you for everyone who's watching it after it's posted. Before we go, I wanted to remind everyone of the exciting events coming up with Authorama with these amazing authors. So we have some in-person events coming up. We have a special story time with Vanjie Garrett at the Katy Branch Library, July 27th, which is tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. And also at Spring Branch Library on August 4th at 10:30 a.m. And then we're also going to have local Houstonian author JL in person at Monmark's Library, July 28th at 4:30 p.m. So I really hope I can see you guys all there, and thanks for tuning in.